Me too.
So,
We've already asked the question.
right, tell us about the movements in the northern Shenandoah Valley at the start of the war.
At the outbreak of the war, United States military authorities looked at a map, and specifically General Winfield Scott, who was in command of the United States Army at that time, and a heralded, very famous general in the United States Army. And he looks at what is the easiest place to attack the enemy. Where can we get them and get them quickly? And so, of course, Virginia becomes that target for General Scott. And he specifically looks at Virginia in response to places of defense that Robert E. Lee had selected along the frontier, along the border of Virginia, to try to protect Virginia, because Lee expected Union incursions. He fully expected the Federal Army would be invading Virginia, and Lee anticipated that the first battle of the war would likely occur in Virginia. And so Winfield Scott determines that there's really two principal approaches, two principal avenues that the Federal Army can advance early in the war. This is now within the first 8 to 12 weeks of the war to drive into Virginia. One of those he selects is Manassas, or near Manassas Junction. This is located about 30 miles from Washington, and you'll recall that General Lee had selected Manassas Junction, that very important railroad junction, as a principal location of Confederate defense. The second area that Winfield Scott eyed was Harper's Ferry. And of course, Harper's Ferry had been occupied by the Confederates from the outbreak of the war. Harper's Ferry was now under command of a general, Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston. He had come and superseded Stonewall, or Thomas Jonathan Jackson at that time. And there was a large Confederate force that was gathering in the Harper's Ferry area. There were over 8,000 Confederates there now, and potentially rising up to 10,000. The northernmost Confederate position in the Confederacy is at Harper's Ferry. It is literally the apex. It is at the apex of the Confederacy, is this Confederate defensive position at Harper's Ferry. And so Winfield Scott begins to eye Harper's Ferry and the area around Harper's Ferry as perhaps the first strategic target for the United States Army. So he selects a veteran, Robert Patterson, Major General Robert Patterson, who's almost 70 years old, a native of Pennsylvania. And he asked Patterson to organize a force in Pennsylvania. Now, you remember that President Lincoln had called for 90-day volunteers to come and suppress the rebellion in the South. And so General Scott was going to use Patterson and these Pennsylvania volunteers, who they're going to form up in the Chambersburg area, north of the Mason-Dixon line, but not very far north. That will become a central focus point for these 90-day volunteers. And so what happens is Patterson starts to gather his force, and this first force begins to just strengthen and enlarge. It begins to burgeon and eventually rises to almost 20,000 men. And so by the 1st of June, 1861, Patterson feels ready to move south. Winfield Scott is going to support him moving south into Maryland and ultimately towards Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley. The issue is Harper's Ferry. Do they move against Harper's Ferry, or do they try to move around Harper's Ferry? And this becomes the question for the Federals. And so Patterson moves his force from Chambersburg to Hagerstown, middle of June, June 14, June 15, 1861. This movement alarms Joe Johnston, who is in command at Harper's Ferry. He sees thousands of Union soldiers now moving south of the Mason-Dixon line into Maryland. And Johnston anticipates properly, that their target is the Shenandoah Valley and probably Harper's Ferry. There's been quite a bit of discussion between General Patterson and General Winfield Scott about an advance against Harper's Ferry. Patterson is even talking about the first battle of the war will be waged at Harper's Ferry. He expects the Confederates, as he will write, to make a stout defense, a strong resistance at Harper's Ferry. So they expect action. They expect combat. Scott's willing to back Patterson up, but he's telling Patterson, you cannot lose. You cannot lose. Even a draw is a loss. That if we're going to meet them, we must thrash them. Anything less than a complete defeat and a complete retreat by the Confederate force would not be a victory for the North. And so Patterson, methodically, cautiously moving, when he arrives at Hagerstown, he's suddenly surprised by the immediate abandonment and the unexpected evacuation of Harper's Ferry by the Confederates. Joe Johnston will retreat rapidly into the interior, go 30 miles further south into Virginia to Winchester, and Patterson now faces a new dilemma. What will the Federals do next?